From Fox 8 Sports, this is the Overtime Podcast.
From the Fox 8 studios in New Orleans, it's the Fox 8 Overtime Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Fazende, riding shotgun as he does each and every podcast is Andre Johnson.
Junior.
Do not forget the Junior. It's very important to remember the JR at the end of the name. Before we get into today's content, though, be sure to like, share, rate, review. If you are watching us on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Get the bell notification for when we drop that fire content. And also, hello to the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network. Glad you have found us here. We're glad to be here. We're glad you were able to see us. It is Wednesday in the city of New Orleans. I just got back from the city of Mobile for the Senior Bowl. Matter of fact, I just pulled up like an hour ago. It's been a whirlwind 48 hours in Mobile, Alabama. Always a lot of things happening on the field with the coaching staff, what's happening with the Saints, what's happening with everything. It's always a busy time. There's a lot of people converging down in Mobile, Alabama for the Senior Bowl. There's a lot of things happening. That's why a lot of news comes out of that area. So I am now back. I will save some of my thoughts of what I saw from the Senior Bowl for a later pod because a lot has happened in the Saints coaching search, and we're going to get to that with the pod. But first things first, how you feeling?
I'm feeling good. You know, it is so New Orleans and so Louisiana for us to have historic snowfall 7 days ago, and now it's short sleeve weather outside.
Short sleeve weather, and it's going to be like a really nice weekend here in New Orleans. It's going to be like very comfortable weather.
I was talking about mini golf with the wife.
Yeah.
That's how quickly things change here.
I don't know what's going on. I feel like this chair has been moved because I keep having to readjust this microphone here. So,
somebody is messing with the
somebody's
Overtime
messing with the
and
podcast.
We know about you.
Yeah, we're gonna figure that out. We're gonna find a culprit. All right. So mechanics aside and moving of logistics aside, here we got a podcast to do here, and it regards to, or it has to do with the Saints coaching search, where now we can definitively say all signs point to the guy they want being Eagles offensive coordinator Kellen Moore. That's the big picture today.
Yep. Cliff Kingsbury says he's good. He's going to stay in Washington. Mike McDaniel says he's good.
McCarthy.
Mike McCarthy. I've been doing that for like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Mike McCarthy says he's good. He's going to stay unemployed in the coaching search for right now. So now all eyes point towards Kellen Moore, who's really become the front runner for this Saints job, which is the last head coaching opening in the NFL. But as we focus in on Kellen Moore, Sean, is he really the right guy for the Saints?
All right. You know, when all the names get put out there first and you do your short list like we've done, Kellen Moore was on there, but he wasn't at the top to start. He really wasn't. And I don't know how close he was to the top of the Saints list he was. Now, if he gets the job, they will say he was the top guy all along, Let's be honest. But I think it's fair to say now, more than fair, it's real. Kellen Moore is now, as we sit here on this Wednesday, what date is today? Is it January 20-something?
28, 29?
20, almost February.
Yeah.
Is the guy the Saints want for head coach. He's the front runner. He's the favorite. I have hesitated to use that word all search because I didn't want to call McCarthy the front runner. I didn't want to call Aaron Glenn the front runner. I didn't want to call Joe Brady the front runner because the searches take wide-ranging twists and turns. Under normal circumstances, this is even taken even more twists and turns for the Saints coach. The second one they've had to do in a 4-year span when they didn't have to touch it for 16 years before that. So let's just get into that. The search has been, on the outside looking in, it looks like it has been, frankly, a disaster. It's been a long, winding road and confusing road to interview candidates, to set up interview candidates, to mention names of candidates, but never actually talking to candidates, allegedly, to now we can definitively say Kellen Moore is the guy at the top of their list. We now know McCarthy backed out. We obviously know Cliff Kingsbury backed out. Or I'm not even sure Cliff Kingsbury was ever really in. There was never any specific timetable of him getting an interview. He was very outspoken about not wanting to touch it until after the season ended. And by the time the season ended, the only one left was the Saints.
Right.
Take that information what you will. And obviously we know Joe Brady, who was beloved here, backed out. And of those three, Joe Brady was the only one to actually do an interview despite the links to the organization, which is amazing to me. let's call it what it is, horrible optics. Horrible
Not a great
optics. Not great, just horrible. McCarthy, that first, weird. Just weird talk about the McCarthy situation, because I was on the radio. They're like, what do you think's happening? I'm like, it could be a myriad of things, but the fact that they have talked up interviewing, it has been reported about a potential meetup, an interview, whether it's virtual or in person, since the thing started, since Mike McCarthy became available, since Mickey Loomis's press conference, and still, they never even got to the interview phase. I just wonder if there was some sort of behind-the-scenes kind of dialogue that didn't count as an interview. It was just more of, pre-existing conditions. Let's call it that way. This is the parameters of what we're going to work with before we even get to the interview phase. And maybe they weren't out of line. Maybe they just couldn't, get on the same page. And in that meantime, they said, well, we're going to go and look at some other options that don't have these sort of expectations in place. And Mike McCarthy has a different resume than these other guys. So that would make sense. And given the fact that Moore they've got on a plane and flew to Philly at the day after the NFC Championship game to meet with Moore, tells you all you need to know about the urgency of the matter. Because I think now they understand, okay, we got to find a coach. Yeah. We've got to find a coach. But look, maybe he got wind that Moore was going to be the front runner and he decided to back out. But he was not the front runner from the beginning. We've already said this. He was not the front runner. If you had to poll, just look at I know gambling odds don't mean a thing, but look, Moore, I'm not even sure he was in the top 4 of the gambling odds when he first started. So, Moore may be the guy now, but he was not at the start of the situation. But as I said on the last pod, even with the bad optics are temporary. Even with the bad optics are exactly that. It's just perception of what is going on. Even with the weird and ugly journey that has been the 2025 New Orleans Saints head coaching search, if you are able to end up with Kellen Moore as your head coach, that's a win. And everything is salvaged, and everything would have been not necessarily worth it, but at least explained. It sucked. We had to work so hard, and there was some complications and some things where, there was some adjustments to plans. But you know what? We still got our guy. We may look like fools, or may look like we don't know what we're doing, or perhaps the perception is we're not necessarily sure which way this is going, and we had to, reshuffle the deck, whatever the case may be, but we still landed a young offensive mind as head coach, which is something everybody wanted. And B, and this is what a lot of you and I talked about throughout the year. This is what other pods have talked about, other publications have talked about. Most people are on board with the idea of someone with zero ties to the organization. So even after all the craziness that has ensued, you still end up with a young, bright offensive mind, something you've always wanted, something everybody wants, and he has zero ties to the organization, a completely fresh way of doing things, if you're able to land Kellen Moore. Oh, and check this out. Check the numbers. He's a good coordinator. Yeah. I went back and looked. 2021 with the Cowboys, first in scoring. 2022 with the Cowboys, fourth in scoring. 2024, this past year with Philly, seventh in scoring. He's doing something right. Now, 2023 with the Chargers, they slipped a little bit, but that was the year, I believe, Justin Herbert missed 4 games, if I'm not mistaken. So that year, and that was a lame duck with Brandon Staley. Everyone kind of knew he was out at that point. So it certainly adds. I think Saints fans will be on board with this hire. And I also think it's certainly, if it happens, okay, being the front runner, being the guy, is 2 different things. And it certainly adds a new level of intrigue to that big event that's going to be happening in New Orleans in about a week and a half. True. Saints fans, especially for Saints fans, your potential next head coach is calling plays to potentially win the biggest game of his life in your building. Adds a little layer of intrigue to a game that, let's be honest, not a lot of people like this matchup with Kansas City and certainly Philly. So that is all positive. Now we have to get to the flip side. Yeah. And it's this. What if? And given the way the search is gone, you can't rule this out. What if Kellen Moore says no? You talk about devastating. You talk about optics. You talk about a bad situation. Oh, the meltdown if Kellen Moore says no thanks, I'm out. How devastating that would be.
I think you got to start printing them Rizzler shirts.
And then at that point, you got to go with Darren Rizzi and say, you know what? So what? They're going to say what they're going to say. We got to roll with this guy because at that point, he becomes the best candidate. And I think at that point, yes, fans would be miserable, but also, yes, fans would understand, and certainly we would understand. He's the best option at that point because at that point, you really dip into some guys that probably are not ready to be head coaches. That's just that. But for now, it's time to say, New Orleans Saints, do all you can, contract-wise, money-wise, control-wise, to go and get Kellen Moore. What say you?
You know, the question being, is Kellen Moore the right guy for the Saints? I think it comes down to not as much is Kellen Moore right for the Saints, but all the other guys are wrong for the Saints. I mean, you kind of touched on it just now, but if you can't get Kellen Moore here, Joe Brady's gone, Cliff Kingsbury's gone, Mike McCarthy's gone, Aaron Glenn is gone, Pete Carroll's gone, Mike Vrabel's gone. Everybody who we named when we had the podcast a few weeks ago and talked about them potentially being a good fit for the Saints, they're gone. They've taken other jobs. Nobody's, like you said at the start, nobody said they wanted Kellen Moore. We weren't talking about
there is no way
Kellen
he was the
Moore
top guy on the
here.
list. No way.
I mean, we read the comments. Nobody in the comments even said, hey, I think Kellen Moore would be a great fit in New Orleans. Nobody had Kellen Moore on the radar, but when all those other guys said no, Kellen Moore comes into play. Now, I think that there are certain things you can criticize about Kellen Moore, even his time in Dallas. I mean, Dallas was coming off 3 winning seasons when he took them over, and they ran a particular brand of offense. And it was Dak Prescott being used as more of a game manager, and it was Ezekiel Elliott, who at the time was arguably the best running back in football, eating, as they used to say, eat, Zeke, eat. Dak game manage, Zeke run the ball, they work off the run. Kellen Moore takes over, and it kind of flips. Zeke kind of took a back seat while Dak became a gunslinger. They put up great numbers, but it didn't always result in winning. Now, the year he left, Dallas was still number 1 in offense in the NFL. Dallas was a stacked team altogether, you know. But at the end, like you said, he was pretty average with the Chargers considering the situation. So you can certainly say things about Kellen Moore, but this is less about Kellen Moore and more about you look at the guys after him. Mike Kafka, who they've interviewed twice. The New York Giants stink on offense. They stunk last year. They stunk the year before. I mean, they have not been a good offense under Mike Kafka. So what makes you think bringing Mike Kafka here would all of a sudden take a Saints offense to the next level? I mean, the Saints offense now, with all the injuries, the backups, Spencer Rattler, Kendre Miller, Bub Means.
Kafka would do nothing to energize this fan base.
The offense, as injured as it was still better than the Giants offense this past year, who had Malik Neighbors and, you know, Tyrone Tracy and all of those guys. So, I mean, I just don't think Mike Kafka is the hire. Anthony Weaver has 1 year of experience as a defensive coordinator. I don't think he's ready for this job right now. And Darren Rizzi, I mean, he ultimately lost every game that mattered. When we first sat here and we talked about what does Darren Rizzi need to do to keep this Saints job, I said he's got to win a game that he's not supposed to win. He beat Atlanta, but, I mean, Dennis Allen could have beaten Atlanta. He was a Paulson Adebo pass interference away from beating Atlanta in Week 4. He beat Cleveland. They stink. He beat the New York Giants barely, by the way, Mike Kafka, a game he scored 11 points in with the New York Giants offense. So those are the games he won. He lost against the Rams, playoff caliber team. He had Derek Carr in that game. He lost against Washington Commanders, which is the weird game where he decided to start Haener, then bench Haener and go with Rattler. He lost against Green Bay, where he got shut out and embarrassed in prime time on Monday Night Football. And speaking of embarrassment, you lost to the Las Vegas Raiders, who were playing for Cam Ward and Shador Sanders. And yes, you started a backup in Spencer Rattler, but they started a backup in Aiden O'Connell. You had 2 bad rosters and 2 backups going against each other, and you lost to the Raiders in the Superdome. And then you go to Tampa and you lose to Tampa Bay in a game where you had control of it for a while and you lose that game. So Darren Rizzi had an opportunity to prove why he was the right guy for this job, and I don't think he did enough during his time having this job to prove that. So when you look at the resumes of Rizzi, you look at the resume of Kafka, you look at the resume of Weaver, you look at the long list of people who either took other jobs or said, nah, I'm good on this Saints job. Kellen Moore, I mean, at this point, he's the best option. You can nitpick Kellen Moore and say, oh, he's done that, he's done this. He's better than the other guys that they have. My fear for Kellen Moore, really, because I do agree with you, the Saints need to go all in on him at this point. You mentioned he's playing here in the Super Bowl. let's say he wins that Super Bowl. Can Kellen Moore kind of take the same approach that Joe Brady and Cliff Kingsbury did?
It's possible.
Joe Brady essentially said, I'm good here in Buffalo. I'm going to come back in Buffalo next year. We're going to have an elite offense because I have one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and there will be better job opportunities for me to take next year. I don't have to settle on a Saints job where the salary cap situation's awful. You've got an old, aging roster with talent questions, and you don't have a franchise quarterback. Cliff Kingsbury said, I'm good. I have the Rookie of the Year. There will be another job next year. There's a chance Kellen Moore wins the Super Bowl, becomes the hottest coordinator in the league, and says the same thing. So at this point, Saints, you got to go all in on Kellen Moore and hope and pray he says yes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's with the Super Bowl team. I don't think they could actually announce it till after the Super Bowl.
Can't.
So if you go to Super Bowl weekend, there's still no news. It's probably a good sign. Now, if you go to Super Bowl weekend, there's a leak saying, I think Kellen Moore is going to stay back and roll with Philly one more year. Then that's obviously not a good sign. And at that point, you would have to point to Rizzi. But I think that's the only option left that I think would breathe some life into this organization, give it a little juice from the fan base. And, I mean, you got to – I don't know Kellen Moore. I don't know his personality. I don't know if he's a fiery personality. I don't know if he's a presence, walking the room. I don't know if he's kind of a mad scientist type. I do know he was a former quarterback, so it's not like a guy that's never picked up a football and just kind of one of these mad scientists.
At Boise State, and they used to let him
And
sling that ball
at one point, he was
Boise
the
State.
winningest coach, winningest player in college football, had the most wins of anyone in college football. So this is a guy that's played the game. He's coached a lot, and he's earned the respect of his peers. And more importantly, he's taking interviews. Like, he's taking the interviews.
Right.
So, which is something that has become hard to come by with the Saints in this process, because Cliff Kingsbury always felt a little like a long shot. I think the Saints, you got to do your due diligence and at least reach out to him. But given the way it went with Arizona for him, you never got the perception that he was itching to jump back into it, especially with the situation that he's got there. Joe Brady was always one where it's like you were right on the line with. He was my number one guy from the start. But the fact that he chose to stick around with Buffalo, to me, it was not. Was it a surprise? No, I think that always could have happened. I don't know if he still would have gotten the job had the interview process gone even further. But now with Kellen Moore, Mike McCarthy, again, is the one I just can't. Clearly, stuff happened behind the scenes. You don't leak out that you want to interview a guy multiple times and talk about sometime next week, and then never actually gets the interview, and then he backs out of the race. Something happened behind the scenes. Right. Whether that's good on the Saints or good on McCarthy or whatever the case may be, they never got to the initial stage of this. And he was a guy you and I talked about a lot. So if you're the Saints right now, you've taken all this heat, you've taken all this blowback, you're the last team searching. I don't think you got a choice. You got to go all in with Kellen Moore. And there's been some talk out there about power struggle, this and that. The one thing I've been hard on Mickey Loomis, the one thing I would give him, he lets his coaches coach, and he lets his coaches pick their staff, and he doesn't interfere. So this idea of a potential power struggle, I mean, I guess it's, if you want to word it that way, that's one thing. Maybe there's a disagreement in the structure of the organization, but Mickey does not interfere. He never has when it comes to his head coaches. So I just hope Kellen Moore sees this as an opportunity, and Kellen Moore says, you know what? I know it doesn't look good right now, but I'm going to turn this franchise around. I hope that is the case, because right now I think it's the best option left.
Yeah, I mean, he checks the boxes, and fun fact, just to speak to how young Kellen Moore is, he beat Derek Carr in college. That is how young Kellen Moore is.
How about that?
He and Derek Carr played against each other, Boise State versus Fresno State, and he outdueled Derek Carr actually in that game. But, I mentioned I wanted a young offensive mind here. Kellen Moore is young. He's an offensive mind, but despite being so young, he has a lot of NFL experience.
Does have a lot of experience for a young guy.
That's what I'm saying. And he's worked with a lot of young quarterbacks, from Dak Prescott, the 1 year with Justin Herbert. He's working with Jalen Hurts right now. He's worked with some good running backs, Ezekiel Elliott during his heyday in Dallas, Saquon Barkley, who's lighting the world on fire and was a stat game away from potentially having the greatest season of all time at running back in the NFL. Like, he's worked with some solid players, and he's got a long resume for somebody who's as young as him. He's somebody who, I mean, anybody you hire, this would have to be the case, but he's somebody who you would have to be patient with. You're going to have to let him make his mistakes as head coach.
Got to let him learn on the job.
Understand that this is not a winning situation. This is not a team where you hire Kellen Moore, like Saints hired Sean Payton, and all of a sudden you're right in the championship picture.
God, that would be so foolish if they went that. If they really think that.
You cannot think that you're
cannot.
hiring Kellen Moore and going straight to the top. This is going to be long, and this is going to be painful, and it's not necessarily going to be Kellen Moore's fault. Just like it wouldn't have been Joe Brady's fault or Cliff Kingsbury's fault necessarily, Aaron Glenn's fault. This is not a great roster talent-wise. This is not a young roster when you look to building for the future. This is a roster that's 50, 60 million over the cap. They've got to clear that just to start the offseason, just to be able to make free agent acquisitions and sign your draft picks. So really, we talk about 50, 60 million. They really got to clear about 70, 80 million, which is going to require cuts, which is going to require restructures. Like there's a lot of just numbers involved that are going to make your head spin because of the situation that Mickey Loomis and the front office ultimately put this Saints
whoever this coach
in.
is going to be. Yeah.
So you're going to have to be patient.
And there's something you mentioned there because you talked about his time with Dallas. And look, it was always under McCarthy, right? It was always under McCarthy when he was with Dallas. And I know there was a time where McCarthy, he was the OC, Moore was the OC, but McCarthy was calling plays, and it felt like they went a little bit back and forth.
Yeah.
But if it is true that, when he first started calling plays, he kind of veered away from Ezekiel Elliott, what he's doing now in Philly, to me, shows growth.
That is true.
Because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. He's smart enough to understand, I got the best running back in football. Let's let him cut it loose. Let's let him run. And sometimes that's hard for a former quarterback. Look, the former head coach here that, he was a young offensive mind. There was that famous line, sometimes he gets the sickness because he always wants to throw the ball too much. That was the Parcells line about Sean Payton. So to me, that shows and demonstrates a level of growth for a young guy like that and that has learned, you have to basically don't be a detriment to your own success. If you got the best player on the field, pretty much every time you step on offense, you use it. So, and as you mentioned, this is now 5 years as a coordinator? Yeah. Offensive. That's a good amount of time. He's 36, 37 years of age.
Young enough to play Derek Carr in college.
And that's the other thing. It's what do you do at quarterback? Because I think, just based off the numbers, I've already said this, I still think the more fiscally responsible thing is to just restructure Carr. That way you ain't got to restructure the entire roster to get rid of him. But he's one with different types of quarterbacks. Maybe he likes Spencer Rattler. Maybe he likes somebody at the Senior Bowl right now. Maybe he likes another free agent quarterback. Maybe there's somebody on the Philly roster that he likes.
Yeah.
A former first-round pick. So all intriguing options, but this whole pod is predicated on Moore's the guy, and if you're the Saints, you got to get him. You've got to get that guy.
Absolutely, and that kind of leads us to a question that we've got from the viewers. Final Play apps, send the questions in. Type them in the comments. We read them. From Brandon, from Laplace, how alarming is it that candidates with no head coaching experience like Aaron Glenn and Joe Brady are turning down the Saints head coach position?
Again, if it's just a singular thing, then you would say, okay, I always knew Aaron Glenn was going to the Jets. Joe Brady, if it were just Joe Brady, you could say, maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe he doesn't feel comfortable. I can understand that. But you add it all up, combined with the other two with head coaching experience that never even got to the front door with an interview. Yeah, that's not a good look. And that's why they're taking a beating right now with the way the search has gone. So at some point, this has to be the look in the mirror moment. You've got, okay, look, the perception of us is bad. We got to change it. We got to change it with the right hire. And that's why right now, your back's against the wall. You go get Kellen Moore at this point.
Yeah, and I don't think it's very alarming at all because as a head coach candidate, if you are Joe Brady, if you are Aaron Glenn, sometimes in this league, you only get one shot. You don't necessarily get a second chance after you mess up a job. So your first job is very important because if you get that stigma on you, if you get the ick, as the kids say, to where this guy is not a good coach, even though you were thrust into a bad situation, you may never get another head coaching shot again. I mean, we saw Gerard Mayo, a guy who grew up in the Patriots organization. They love Gerard Mayo. They promote him from within. They give him that Patriots job, a Patriots team that stunk the year before, that was working with a rookie quarterback next to anybody on the offensive line or receiving room, and he failed, as he was expected to fail. And after 1 year, Gerard Mayo's out the door, and I don't even know where Gerard Mayo is right now.
No, and honestly, it's a risk for them, too, to bypass. Because you can Bobby Slowick yourself.
That's true.
You know,
Houston's
you can be the
offensive
hot
coordinator.
name, sit out, and now you're fired after a year. You got to strike with the iron. It's how, you know, Ben Johnson rolled the dice, and it worked out.
Yeah.
And I'm sure someone with head coaching experience like Kingsbury is going to understand the process. And McCarthy, they understand the process. But when you're trying to get that first job in an organization, 1 of 32 comes calling, it's a risky move to say no, because you just never know what's going to happen year to year. But again, you want to talk we got about a minute left.
Yeah.
You want to talk optics, of course. We already talked about that. It's not a good look if all these people turn down jobs / interviews. But there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
Right, and another reason why you would want to get this done as soon as possible, if you do hire Kellen Moore, he's got to hire a staff. And we're starting to see not just all the head coaches get hired up, but all the coordinators get hired up. You just lost Cliff Kubiak to Seattle, and a lot of other guys who are now getting these jobs, they're going to have to fill their staffs, and that's less guys for potentially Kellen Moore to fill his staff with.
Best case scenario, best. The deal's already done, and we don't know about it, and he's already working the back channels to get his guys. That's what I hope is the case.
That would be great.
That would be fantastic. But we don't know yet. So anyway, all right, we're going to get out of here. We got a couple seconds left for Andre Johnson Jr. I am Sean Fazende. We will catch you guys next time on Overtime.